What I'm presenting to you today are the partial results of the work I've been able to pursue during my stay here at the EKKM. After having enjoyed the opportunity to speak to some of you last semester on questions of cinema and the convection of different kinds of energy into movement and motion, I want to take this theme in a slightly different direction tonight, while also touching on its wider implications, not least in order to decide in which discipline this research of mine might be most at home: film studies or media studies, Kulturtechnik or media philosophy, precisely the sort of question a stay at EKKM encourages. I want to thank the EKKM, its directors, staff and fellow researchers for allowing me to exchange ideas so freely and so productively. And I want to apologize for rewarding you all with what is no more than a loosely sketched roadmap across some very bumpy terrain, rather than giving you, as I should at the end of my stay, a polished, rounded-off essay. A few words about my title, Film and Philosophy. The profusion of conferences, multi-authored volumes and monographs published in the last 15 years under this heading and across the usual discourse and language barriers French, English and German confirms that film and philosophy has not only become a scholarly field in its own right, but that its flourishing has symptomatic character. It responds to a need or a demand, it scratches an itch or tends a wound that it would be worth probing more closely than I can do here tonight, but this much is clear. The sudden flurry of activity must have some reasons. I can think of several possible ones that I will leave for another occasion or for the discussion. What I will say is that I'm drawn to film and philosophy because of the difficulties film study seems to have with cogently analyzing the surprisingly smooth transition from analog to digital formats in both film production and in film reception, which means coming to terms with the apparent obsolescence of the so-called photographic ontology and all the aporias that have flowed from this reliance on photography as both the cinema's material support and its medium specificity, not to mention the close alignment of the cinema screen's two-dimensional surface with a history and ideology of easel painting and Renaissance monocular perspective, none of which, as we now realize, is constitutive and defining for moving images, but contingent and historically determined. In all fairness, some film and media scholars are well aware of these conceptual dilemmas and have begun to revise our understanding of cinema precisely in this way. They speak about graphics in motion rather than photography, for instance Lev Manovich, or they re-examine the film experience in its spatio-temporal locatedness as event, cinema theory rather than film theory. Some treat sound as equally important as the image, others go back to the attempts in the 1960s in semiotics in order to re-examine different theories of the sign. This, for instance, is happening not by a return to the linguistic Saussure, but with recourse to Charles Sanders Peirce, notably around his notion of the indexical function of the sign, whose supposed loss with a turn to the digital image has engendered a lively debate. It shows, incidentally, what a fine nose the directors of the EKKM have for cutting-edge research, in that virtually all the major participants in this debate about the index are former and present fellows, such as Tom Gunning, Marianne Doan and David Roderick, as well as Michel Chillon, Francesco Casetti and Rick Altman. Why after Deleuze? Besides any number of conjunctural reasons for the current alliance between film and philosophy, they miss the single most important factor, namely the intervention by one philosopher who in the mid-1980s published two books on the cinema that more or less upended the entire field, mainly by dismissing or ignoring pretty well everything that had been written about film as a theoretical object since the 1960s. This philosopher was Gilles Deleuze. Hence, the second part of my title, which has a threefold reference. First of all, it wants to acknowledge Deleuze's preeminent position in the field of film and philosophy today. Secondly, my title is intended as an homage to Lorenz Engel, who together with Oliver Fahler, already back in 1997, published a book called in French Le Cinéma selon Deleuze, which translated to English would be The Cinema After Deleuze, in the sense of according to Deleuze. And thirdly, I call it After Deleuze because, now switching to German, Nach Deleuze ist vor Deleuze, a phrase every German football fan recognizes, but which also, in its original form, serves as the motto of Tom Tykwer's Lola rennt. After Deleuze is before Deleuze because his intervention has occasioned and necessitates a still ongoing revision and reassessment of all of film theory from its beginnings in the 19-teens and 20s down to the present, and thus well beyond Deleuze's death in 1995. Now, rather than pursuing the matter of the index, I'm choosing a topic that has briefly been touched upon in the context of photography a few weeks ago right here, and that for me involves also a larger question, namely how the cinema, once it comes under the purview of philosophy, becomes a matter of aesthetics and ethics, of epistemology and ontology. The single topic around which these options can be discussed is that of the cinema's purported automatism. To capture, understood as the inherent capacity of the camera, whether photographic or cinematographic, to capture and register lifelike, natural images by a mechanical process, without the intervention of human intention or volition. From William Henry Fox Talbot's 1844 announcement of photography as the pencil of nature to André Bazin's 1958 essay on the ontology of the photographic image, the automatic registration of perceptual reality has been the central fact discussed in any theoretical or philosophical treatise on either photography or film. Bazin's is the most canonical and celebrated formulation of cinematic automatism. I quote, "The originality of photography in relation to painting lies in its essential objectivity. For the first time, an image of the exterior world is formed automatically without creative intervention by man, according to a rigorous determinism. The personality of the photographer enters into the action only by the choice, the orientation, the pedagogy of the phenomenon. All the arts are based on the presence of man. In photography alone, we enjoy his absence. It acts on us as a natural phenomenon like a flower or a snowflake, the beauty of which is inseparable from vegetable or earthly origins." End of quote from Bazin. I shall not attempt to summarize the myriad of commentaries that this passage has provoked and concentrate instead on some of the consequences and implications drawn from this purported automatism. The list of those who have singled it out for analysis when discussing the cinema is long. It starts with Henri Bergson and Hugo Münsterberg and includes Jean Epstein, Sergei Eisenstein, Rudolf Arnheim, Béla Balázs, Walter Benjamin, André Bazin, Siegfried Kracauer, Stanley Cavell, but also Gilles Deleuze, Jean-Luc Nancy, Alain Badiou, Jacques Rancière, as well as in photography, Roland Barthes, Susan Sontag, Roger Scruton, Kendall Walton, Noel Carroll, and many other philosophers of aesthetics. I shall restrict myself to a much smaller circle, and in the next 40 minutes or so, try to sketch something like the outlines of this debate that separates and unites these different positions. My hope is that a more thorough understanding of the cinema's automatism might trace another path, not just from the analog to the digital image and its aesthetic implications, but from the cinema as an aesthetic phenomenon to a force that has altered, or at least significantly affected, our relation to and our being in the world, and this in ways that might allow us to ask not only Bazin's question, qu'est-ce que c'est le cinéma, what is cinema, or a frequent question heard today, what was cinema, but also why is cinema? Why does cinema exist? A question I consider philosophical in a primary, if not primitive sense. Aesthetics, impersonal automatism as an image factory. For much of the first half of the 20th century, the gist of the debate was whether this photographic automatism disqualifies the cinema from being an art form, unless human intentionality could be seen to intervene through staging, framing, selection, but above all, through montage and editing. This is the view held by filmmakers and theorists called formalists, as opposed to realists, and in the 1920s and 30s included Eisenstein and Rudolf Arnheim. As late as 1974, Arnheim restated his position that, I quote, "The fundamental peculiarity of the photographic medium is that the physical objects themselves print their image by means of the optical and chemical actions of light. When we look at photographs, we are on vacation from artifice." End of quote. One early dissenting voice was that of the French filmmaker Jean Epstein, who in an essay from 1921 called Bonjour Cinéma anticipates Bazin when he writes, I quote, "Cinema, by and large, doesn't do justice to the story. The drama we're watching is unfolding on the curative slope of the crisis. The real tragedy looms over all the faces. It is in the curtain and in the door latch. At every moment, the entire room is saturated with the drama. The cigar burns on the lip of the ashtray like a threat. Poisonous arabesques stretch across the rug, and the arm of the seat trembles. Expectation. We can't see a thing yet, but the tragic crystal that will turn out to be at the center of the plot has fallen down somewhere. Its wave advances, concentric circles. It keeps on expanding from relay to relay. Is whether they are getting married in the end really all you want to know? Cinema is true. The story is a lie." End of quote from Epstein. For Epstein, then, true cinema is the way the camera captures a door latch or a burning cigarette in an ashtray, and he calls this automatism photogenie, the capacity of the camera to imbue with beauty, grace, and presence the most banal of objects and gestures. Exceeding language and making a mockery of meaning and intrigue, photogenie is what the camera lens lays bare, directing the human eye to what it cannot discover directly, but what will fill the soul with suspense and wonderment. Epstein's passage launches a philosophy of disclosure and revelation that one finds in Dziga Vertov's Kino Eye, as well as in Walter Benjamin's Optical Unconscious, where the camera penetrates into aspects of reality that register with our bodies and senses, but may not be processed consciously. It reappears in Bazin and Cavell, becomes axiomatic as one side of an intertwined process in Rancière's idea of the cinema as a thwarted fable, and it receives its Heideggerian elaboration in Jean-Luc Nancy's notion of the evidence of film and its capacity for Entbergen disclosure. It's also Roland Barthes' obtuse or third sense in photography. At the same time, there have been, and not only among Anglo-American analytical philosophers, many voices contesting the very basis of this automatism, by arguing either that selection and intervention are always present, or that the mechanical registration of the camera is only different by degrees from automatisms in the other arts, and this in several respects. After all, since the Renaissance, draftsmen and painters like Brunelleschi, Dürer, Vermeer, or Canaletto have devised optical instruments and developed technical devices in order to produce their paintings. And Manet, Degas, and even Cézanne are known to have used cameras and photographs. But even when no mechanical device is involved, painting has elements of automatism if we assume that automatism, as Bazin conceives it, rests on a causal process that is similar to other physical and natural processes, in this case, chemical reactions of certain substances to light. Noel Carroll has made the strongest counter-argument when he claims, I quote, "Painting is an automatic process because the process of physically manifesting a painted representation is both natural and causal. And since every medium of art is a physical process, and every physical process is a causal process, every causal process is natural, and every natural process is therefore automatic. Therefore, every medium of art is a physical process that is automatic." If this seems a reductio ad absurdum of Bazin's position, it nonetheless raises important issues about the status of volition and intention on the part of the artist, issues that take us back to the circumstances under which automatism entered the aesthetic debate in the first place. For Bazin, no less than Benjamin, was also perfectly aware of another powerful current inspired by cinematic automatism, not only as a way of getting closer to reality through mechanical means, but to synchronize the workings of the human mind with the workings of the camera. It was, after all, surrealism that promoted automatic writing as a way of stimulating the imagination and of aligning the body and language with the camera's capacity of capturing the flux and movement of sensation and of ever-changing impressions, but also to force into the open that which was not accessible to volition and conscious thought. As André Breton acknowledged, I quote, "Automatic writing, which appeared at the end of the 19th century, is a true photography of thought." As well as making a bolder political claim, again, Breton, an appeal to automatism in all its forms is our only chance of resolving outside the economic plane all the antinomies which, since they existed before our present social regime was formed, are not likely to disappear even when it disappears. Bazin, a few years later, made equally bold claims on another front, namely that cinematic automatism, understood in the spirit of the surrealist material, would be able to reconcile the arts and the sciences. In a review of the work of Jean Pain-Lévy, a director of underwater science and nature films, Bazin wrote, I quote, "While the goal of such works is primarily practical and interested, the results are nevertheless miraculous and poetic." Or put another way, Pain-Lévy's science films no longer allow us to distinguish with certainty between the practical and the impractical, between the interested and the disinterested, the scientific and the poetic. Is there a brilliant choreographer, a delirious painter, a poet who could imagine these patterns, these shapes, these images? He's referring to a very well-known film about seahorses. The camera alone holds the key to this world, whose supreme beauty is that of nature and chance. In other words, everything that a certain aesthetic tradition views as the opposite of art. Only the surrealists had a presentiment of its existence. In the impersonal automatism of their imagination, they sought the secrets of an image factory. Ethics, trust and belief in the world. Writers not normally associated with surrealism, such as Ezra Pound, W.B. Yeats, or Virginia Woolf, were also after modes of impersonality and even practiced versions of automatic writing. James Joyce, for instance, as David Trotter has shown, tried in the Wandering Rock section of Ulysses to enact in his prose and verbal punning a will to automatism that testifies to, I quote, this is quoting David Trotter, a determination to view the world for however brief an interval as a machine would view it. Trotter's book is an attempt to write the cinema, and indeed pre-cinema of optical toys and stereoscopic views, back into the canonical texts of high modernist literature. While ostensibly ignoring the cinema as popular art, these writers' novels and poems are marked by an attempt to emulate the cinema's effects, even more than its techniques, like montage. And what Trotter finds is that in many cases, it is the paradoxical combination of a heightened sense of presence with a melancholy awareness of absence that overcomes them when commenting on the cinema's automatism. As Virginia Woolf famously put it, film reveals to us life as it is when we have no part in it. Such is the ambiguous aspect of cinema's automatism that from the sensations it produces, writers and philosophers have asked themselves ethical questions, notably about what it means to be present in the world while being absent to it. Perhaps no one has phrased it more sharply than Stanley Cavell in his 1971 book, The World Viewed, Reflections on the Ontology of Film. Taking a subtitle and cue from Bazin, Cavell gives Bazin's ontological argument a different turn, when he asks himself what the cinema's autonomism means, not for the artist and for aesthetics, but for the viewer as citizen, as part of the community, and as member of the human race. I quote Cavell. The advent of photography expresses distance as the modern fate, to relate to the world by viewing it, by taking views of it, as if from behind the self. Now, if the world is viewed without us having a part in it, does this merely breed the cynicism already expressed by Baudelaire when in Les Fleurs du Mal he spoke of those who, faced with photographs of human misery and violence, swallow the world with a yawn? Is it only giving rise to the sad regrets of a Virginia Woolf? Or is it possible to derive from this presence and absence a new kind of trust in the world? For Cavell, this matter of trust is tied up with his main philosophical concern, which is skepticism. How can we know the world as it really is? How do we ever know what others think? How can we trust our spouses not to betray us? How do we know we're not in Plato's cave? Dissatisfied with Descartes' answer of the cogito, with its infinite coils of self-awareness, recursiveness, and self-doubt, Cavell welcomes the cinema as skepticism's antidote. Counterintuitive as it may sound, the cinema's automatism, precisely because independent of human intervention, guarantees a kind of externality of presence hard to achieve by any other means. The cinema, furthermore, is an appropriate expression of our modernity for Cavell, in that it replicates our existential alienation by bringing us close and keeping us distant all at the same time. Again, quoting Cavell, in viewing films, the sense of invisibility is an expression of modern privacy or anonymity. It is as though the world's projection explains our forms of unknownness and our inability to know. The explanation is not so much that the world is passing us by, as that we are displaced from our natural habitation within it, placed at a distance from it. The screen makes displacement appear as our natural condition. End of quote. In other words, unlike Bazin's argument in support of film's ontological realism as a form of revelation and disclosure, which, let me be clear, involves a more complex and nuanced understanding of cinema than I've been presenting it here, insofar as Bazin speaks as much about imprint, inscription, and trace as he does about visual or phenomenal perception, and thus he also touches on memory, on temporality, and our mortality. Cavell, on the other hand, takes solace from what amounts, not on the other hand, Cavell takes solace from what amounts to a tragic view of life, as manifest in the cinema's relation to the viewer. The cinema, by making us aware that the world can be so fully present to us in all its singularity and manifest bareness, while we are forever absent from it, can help us become reconciled with the world because it instantiates our mortality. It is as if the cinema gratifies one of the most powerfully narcissistic desires, which is not so much to be immortal, something the cinema promises to its performers and stars, as the cinema anticipates what it means to survive one's own death, to be present at one's own funeral, as it were. Consider how unfashionable a view Cavell's was in 1971 when he published the book, when film studies was obsessed with identification and interpolation, with the subject effects of fetishism and castration anxiety. Although in retrospect, it would indeed be possible to argue that Cavell's position of Heideggerian, or some might say Buddhist, Gelassenheit is the verso of Lacanian feminism's recto, two ways of trying to escape the Cartesian double bind, in one case by letting go, in the other by accepting miscognition as the inevitable price of subjectivity and identity. Thus, automatism, as the special and unique quality of cinema for Cavell, is not to be equated with the mechanical. On the contrary, it belongs to a higher order of the human, which is why an ethical demand or mandate might flow from it. For instance, it forces our moral judgment and emotional capacities to extend to the extent that it allows us to experience the world dispassionately in a disinterested, almost Kantian way, because we do not have to act or react, even though the world on screen is sometimes so much more present, so much more alive and there than the world in which we are obliged to act. Our exclusion from the cinematic world might be a bonus, because we can be in the world without having to be accountable. It both cleanses and extends our moral sense, as it were. On the other hand, this privilege also comes with a responsibility. The bonus might contain an onus, an obligation to engage ourselves in the world, to care for the other and take care of the world, thus revealed to us in its naked beauty, its unprotectedness and vulnerability. After Deleuze, as according to Deleuze. Many, if not all, of these reflections belong to what I've called after Deleuze is before Deleuze, meaning that these reassessments of Epstein, Bazin, and Cavell, in short, these rather more positive evaluations of cinematic automatism, are to a considerable extent owed to the repercussions that followed in the light of Deleuze's intervention. One might be tempted, given the emphasis I have put on the notion of the cinema challenging our way of being in the world, to speak of an ontological turn in film studies, but this is correct only in a narrower sense of Deleuze proposing, across the cinema, a different taxonomy for some of our basic categories and binary oppositions: animate, inanimate, being, becoming, body, mind, thought, image, brain, screen, and so on. It would furthermore fail to do justice to the substantially differing positions that have emerged since Deleuze. Since Deleuze published his Cinema 1 and 2, the movement image and the time image. These positions are admittedly almost always formulated in actual or imaginary dialogue with Deleuze, but just as often they also have been dissenting voices, criticizing Deleuze's style of thinking or his philosophical assumptions. When reviewing these critiques, my attention is focused on the status and function of automatism in Deleuze's thinking, which is complicated by the fact that it is a concept so pervasive in his, and indeed Felix Guattari's, philosophy that it connects to almost everything else, making it difficult, for instance, to decide if the cinema is what gave rise to the notion of the spiritual automaton, or if the cinema was merely a further exemplification of a much more general principle of connectivity, contingency, and different kinds of agency. The concept of the spiritual automaton originally came to Deleuze from Spinoza, where it refers to the auto-movement of thought. It is what links one idea to another independently from an object. Spinoza's automaton operates a reversal on the idea that thought is dependent on consciousness, and claims instead that consciousness itself is dependent on the way thoughts are linked with other thoughts. The fact, therefore, that Deleuze chose Spinoza and Leibniz over Descartes and Newton means that he opted for an alternative tradition in both rationalism and materialism. Especially the way Spinoza in his Ethics describes bodies as potentialities for contact and connections resonates with Deleuze, also establishing a link with contemporary thinking about decentered, non-hierarchical and distributed agencies. Phrased more generally, for Deleuze, one of the great philosophical challenges of the cinema is that it does not have to distinguish between the animation of humans, the animations in nature, and the motions of things. Cinema is indifferent to crucial distinction we normally make between, as I said, the living and the inanimate, interior thought and exterior action, the actual and the virtual, the possible and the impossible. As a consequence, the cinema implies a notion of the spiritual automaton that seeks to the common basis between the mechanical and the physiological, between the physical and the psychological, while also fusing motion with motivation and emotion. Such a cinematic perspective might be said to inform, consciously or not, more general theories, including Bruno Latour's actor network theory, for instance, where non-human entities such as things, institutions, sites, and places can have agency, especially when one attends to their interconnections and views them from a performative perspective. Deleuze's philosophical interest in cinema arose from his assumption that the automatism of the cinematographic image resembles mental operations, an analogy already elaborated in some detail by Hugo Münsterberg in 1916. Deleuze, however, takes the idea from Bergson, but not in the form of an analogy, and it comes in the passage that opens his Cinema 1, the movement image. I quote, a slightly lengthy quote. According to Bergson's first thesis on movement, movement is distinct from the space covered. Space covered is past, movement is present, the act of covering. The space covered is divisible, indeed infinitely divisible, whilst movement is indivisible. It cannot be divided without changing qualitatively each time it is divided. This first thesis contains another proposition. You cannot reconstitute movement with positions in space or instances in time, that is, with immobile sections. You can only achieve this reconstitution by adding to the positions, or to the instance, the abstract idea of succession, of a time which is mechanical, homogeneous, universal, and copied from space, identical for all movements. In 1907, in Creative Evolution, Bergson gives this reconstitution a name, the cinematographic illusion. However, and here Deleuze objects, cinema does not give us an image to which movement is added. It immediately gives us movement image. It does give us a section, but a section which is mobile, not an immobile section plus abstract movement. Now, what is odd is that Bergson was perfectly aware of the existence of mobile sections or movement images. This happened before the official birth of the cinema. It was set out in Matter and Memory in 1896. The discovery of the movement image beyond the conditions of natural perception was the extraordinary invention of the first chapter of Matter and Memory. End of quote from Deleuze. In other words, Deleuze rephrases the automatism argument in terms of Bergson's movement image, playing off the earlier Bergson of Matière et Mémoire against the later Bergson of L'évolution créatrice, where Bergson dismissed the cinema on the basis of chronophotography, which for Deleuze, and for us perhaps, is the less interesting of the two origins of cinema. What we might call the Edward Muybridge side, chronophotography, in contrast to the Etienne Jules Murray side, which would be the movement image. Deleuze's argument is much more complex, and it does not base itself either on the realist ontology of Bazin nor on the ethical argument of Cavell. However, besides Bergson, Deleuze does quote Artaud in place of Breton about automatism, and he recognizes Epstein as a precursor, when Epstein asserts that the camera's automatism engendered a new subjectivity that rivets the mind to the machine. In Deleuze's words, I quote, "The cinematographic image that designates the world without intermediary reaches its pure presence. It is under these conditions that Epstein felt that cinema was essentially poetic, making it possible to rediscover a direct and eminently sensual link with the world." End of quote from Deleuze. Behind the attraction of the metaphor of riveting and the avoidance of the cinema-mind analogy in favor of the direct link, I think one can sense Deleuze's desire to distance himself from phenomenology and to circumvent the rift between the order of consciousness and the order of the world. Instead, the image movement of cinema is self-movement, automatic, soliciting the image of thought. Confirmation for Deleuze was provided by all the spiritual automatons that people German expressionist cinema, for instance. Its movie plots of somnambulists, golems, gamblers, and hypnotists Deleuze read as anthropomorphic versions of the cinema's automatism in all its positive ambiguity and uncanny effects. At the same time, Hitchcock's denigration of actors as cattle supports a similar reasoning, but it is Robert Bresson who most fully exemplifies for Deleuze the filmmaker whose attrition of actors to the point of mental and physical exhaustion is designed to release a spirituality that transmitted itself to the spectator as thought. In a 1960s television interview, Bresson did in fact state that he always tried to induce a state of automatism in his actors, and one of the minor players of his film Pickpocket has gone on record of how he had to repeat the same action and same dialogue over and over again until the words and gestures became meaningless, emptying himself of all affect or conscious motor coordination until it felt like he was sleepwalking or under hypnosis. Bresson, for that reason, preferred professional models or lay players to trained actors, arguing in his notes on the cinematographer that, I quote, "9/10 of our movements obey habit and automatism. It is anti-nature to subordinate them to will and thought." End of quote. With his minimalist ascetic style, the very opposite of surrealist flamboyance, Bresson nonetheless considered automatism the most direct way of releasing the mind's unconscious and the body's spirituality. Now, tracing the genealogy of Deleuze's argument from cinematic automatism is necessary, I submit, because it is what ultimately supports and explains the philosopher's most counterintuitive claim, for which he has become notorious, that the cinema is a form of thought and thus can serve as a valid mode of philosophy. Film as philosophy rather than film and philosophy, or indeed philosophy of film. Why is the assumption that the cinema thinks so important and not just a quirk by a very eccentric philosopher? Because it is in turn symptomatic of a new relation that human beings have with mechanical but also electronic images, and which implies a twofold perspective correction to our normal view. It marks a shift from vision and the eye as that which defines and determines the cinema to a cinema as embodiment, in the sense of a particular distribution of space-time units, or mobile sections, as Deleuze calls them, that act on bodies, now understood as continuous perceptual surfaces. This in turn makes possible the idea of the cinema as thought, if thought is conceived thought is conceived of as integral part or special case of the movement that agitates, that activates and regulates these perceptual surfaces we'll call bodies and minds. Such a view would be compatible with assumptions from the neurosciences, where the mind-body is treated as holistically as perceiving and receiving, that is, as processing sensory input through a variety of channels and organs. Blood pressure, brain waves, glucose levels, chemical changes, magnetic resonance, and so on are all seen as relational, interdependent, and quantifiable, and thus have become measurable, which they are not if one were to rely on human sight or mentation alone. The cinema, in other words, would come to be regarded in this context as a powerful agent of this redistribution of the faculties and the senses, and the ways bodies connect and interact. While generally judged by Deleuze as a positive development, the same redistribution of bodies and senses, this reorganization of perception and thought, nonetheless also has its negative side. For the measurable flow of thoughts and sensation can open up new interfaces of surveillance and conduits of control, which substitute for or superimpose themselves on older power knowledge regimes. Analyzed in the name of Foucault as ushering in what Deleuze calls the control societies, Deleuze has itemized many of the proliferating instances of flexibility, of open-ended process thinking and related feedback loops. He calls them modulations, and he saw them as mechanisms of self-control and self-control as self-mobilization. Television, for instance, is for Deleuze almost entirely an apparatus of social control, and he would probably have thought the same of the internet had he lived to refuse to use it. On the other hand, he might have had intriguing things to say about the empowering as well as oppressive ubiquity of everything and everybody that life online has brought about. And no doubt he would have regarded the extraction of ever more data and useful information from our bodies, our thoughts and affects as a new phase in the linkage of brain and machines, and thus in line with the cinema as a spiritual automaton. Towards the very end of the cinema books, Deleuze in fact speculates on the new images. I quote, "The modern configuration of the automaton is the correlate of an electronic automatism. The electronic images are the object of a perpetual reorganization in which a new image can arise from any point whatever of the preceding image. The organization of space here loses its privileged direction, and first of all the privilege of the vertical, which the position of the screen still displays, in favor of an omnidirectional space which constantly varies its angles and coordinates to exchange the vertical and the horizontal. And the screen itself, even if it keeps a vertical position by convention, no longer seems to refer to the human posture, like a window or a painting, but rather constitutes a table of information, an opaque surface on which are inscribed data. Information replacing nature, and the brain city, the third eye, replacing the eyes of nature. In all these senses, the new spiritual automatism in turn refers to a new psychological automata." End of quote. The background against which Deleuze's cinema as thought then becomes important would indeed be the digital realm, not in the sense of dematerialization or the loss of the index, but as introducing a different status in our understanding and our relation to images quite generally. Not as windows on the world, as sites to contemplate or substitutes for material objects, and more like portals, passages, interfaces. True, a vast number of digital images still serve to represent the world and in all relevant respects behave like photographs, i.e. they can be used for purposes of simulation, authentication and substitution of a pre-existing reality. But often enough they are also, along with an increasing number of images that cannot be called photographs, they are also graphic means of storing data or even instructions for action, i.e. they possess agency. This would be the basis for a new ontology of the image if we still choose to call such displays of organized data images, in the way that the human non-interference in the production of photographic images was a new ontology for Bazin's idea of cinema. After Deleuze, how his critics take the argument further or double back on it. Within film studies, Deleuze has split the community. He either has dedicated, if not fanatical followers, or he has been ignored, denounced, and disavowed. But there have been also thoughtful responses by fellow philosophers, sometimes through a very direct engagement with his argument, or by implicitly drawing on his thought as a way of developing their own positions. I shall briefly refer to three of them: Alain Badiou, Jacques Rancière, and Jean-Luc Nancy, before adding an assessment of Friedrich Kittler's thinking on automatism. This will lead me to some concluding remarks that hopefully give an idea of where I would like to take this overall argument about automatism and the cinema. Alain Badiou, in his study Deleuze, The Clamour of Being, introduces the concept of the automaton as part of his general critique of Deleuze's notion of immanence and multiplicity, which he argues is still far too dependent on an implied concept of singularity and totality, and thus still grounds Deleuze's philosophy in transcendental and metaphysical assumptions. In other words, for Badiou, the automaton depends on an act of transfer which gives all the power over the subject to an outside force. I quote Badiou. All those who believe that Deleuze's remarks may be seen to encourage autonomy or the anarchizing ideal of the sovereign individual populating the earth with productions of his/her desires are profoundly mistaken. The figure of the automaton represents the veritable subjective ideal precisely because it demolishes all subjective pretensions. The outside, as agency of active force, takes hold of a body, it selects an individual and submits it to the choice of choosing. Or to quote Deleuze, it is precisely the automaton purified in this way that thought seizes from the outside as the unthinkable within thought. This is Badiou quoting Deleuze. I'm now carrying on quoting Badiou. This purified automaton is certainly much closer to the Deleuzian norm than were the bearded militants of 1968, bearing the standard of their gross desires. We must, through the sustained renunciation of the obviousness of our needs and our established occupied positions, attain that empty place where, seized by impersonal powers, we are constrained to make thought exist through us. End of quote from Badiou. This empty place, Badiou implies, is cinema for Deleuze. Jacques Rancière has been a severe critic of Deleuze's cinema books, arguing, for instance, that the apparently crucial division between movement image and time image cannot be maintained either historically or epistemologically. But where Rancière is close to Deleuze is in the way he expands on the automatism of the cinema, proposing for the duality of mechanical recording on the one hand and human intervention on the other, the concept of the thwarted fable, a way of marking the contending external forces that impinge on the cinema, historically charged, according to Rancière, with continuing the politically emancipatory legacy of the 19th century realist novel, while also developing a language of immediate sensations and direct perceptions. I quote Rancière. If cinema has not fulfilled this promise of a new anti-representative art, this may not be because it has submitted itself to the laws of commerce. It is because the wish to identify it with a language of sensations was contradictory itself. Cinema could only take over the dream of literature at the cost of making it into a pleonasm. Piglets cannot be piglets and words at the same time. The art of the filmmaker can only be the deployment of the specific powers of the machine. These powers of the machine for Rancière are its indifference to hierarchies or taxonomies, making no fundamental distinction between the beautiful and the ugly, the valuable and the insignificant, the doorknob or the duchess. Rancière is here at his most closest to Deleuze when he describes things and people before the camera as being, I quote, in their state as waves and vibrations, before they exist in their qualifications as objects, as persons, or identifiable events by their descriptive or narrative properties. End of quote. In Rancière's version of automatism, then, the cinema is always already divided against itself. As a consequence, the history of cinema, and I would add the history of film theory, has been about how to deal with this thwartedness. That is to say, how to tame the contingent into fables, while nonetheless not losing the force, indeed the life, which the contingent, the random, and the fortuitous of this automatism bring to narrative, to character, and to representation. Jean-Luc Nancy, on the face of it, would decisively disagree with Rancière's reasons for considering the cinema capable of reclaiming the world. In a book ostensibly devoted to the films of Abbas Kiarostami, called L'évidence du film, Nancy also talks about the non-human mechanical gaze and the human or expressive gaze of the camera. But he draws from this more radical conclusions than either Deleuze or Rancière, without mentioning either a historical mission of the cinema, as does Rancière, or the historical breaks of the movement image, the time image, and the digital image, as does Deleuze. In fact, Nancy sharply differs from Deleuze in that he considers both classical cinema and modern cinema as reactionary. Classical cinema because it presumes that the world makes sense and that the cinema can show the sense in action, while modern cinema is reactionary because it is traumatized by the world no longer making sense. At the foundations of modern cinema are Deleuze's pure optical situations that occur when the link between man and the world has been broken. Modern cinema is therefore obsessed with the loss of the world of classical cinema and constantly tries to express this loss either by deconstructing the forms of classicism or by formally emphasizing the loss. But these are for Nancy two sides of the same false coin, because what the cinema's automatism was meant to show is that the world does not exist in order to make sense. By arguing that classical narrative organizes every element of a film towards a predetermined meaning, and modern cinema confronts a world that can no longer be understood while representing this loss with the techniques of documentary and realism, Nancy is taking Bazin's neorealist aesthetics and turns it on its head, while implicitly dismissing both Rancière's thwarted fable and Deleuze's cinema as thought. For Nancy's Nietzschean or Heideggerian move is to argue that this loss of a meaningful world is actually a gain, because a world without meaning is the world itself. Not that the world is nonsense, but that the sense of the world can only be apprehended when we realize that, I quote, the world is not about meaning, but it is merely the locus for meanings. And to go on with a quote, the world finds itself today in the position of art. It serves no design, it produces nothing. Neither does it come from any other world, nor does it move towards another world. It is what it is, because it knows that henceforth it cannot count on anything but itself, not on God, nor on any historical eschatology. End of quote. Whenever the cinema is able to disclose to us this historical and ontological fact, the world opens up. Letting go of meaning actually gives us the world, according to Nancy, and the cinema can thus be a means for freeing ourselves from the obsession with sense, not by representing the world, but by presenting it in its there-ness, its self-evidence, and self-sufficiency. With such an assertion, Nancy is closer to Cavell than to Deleuze, in that he takes up the ethical challenge of cinema's automatism when arguing that what makes the cinema important is that it teaches us to live not just with impersonality, but with meaninglessness. This we should see as a gift, and in this respect Nancy joins both Cavell and Deleuze in being able to envisage how the cinema can restore trust and belief in the world once we accept that it can cleanse the world viewed of meaning and purpose, while giving us, and here Bazin can come back in, the self-sufficiency of a flower or a snowflake, the beauty of which is inseparable from vegetable or earthly origins. Friedrich Kittler. At this point, it's instructive to compare Nancy's position to that of Friedrich Kittler, who comes to a very similar assessment, but from a quite different vantage point. For Kittler, the innovation of the cinematograph is secondary to that of the phonograph, but together they brought about a revolution. For it was the ability to record the raw sense data of ear and eye by technological mechanical means that shifted the discourse network around 1900. Prior to the phonograph and cinematograph, Kittler says, in a much-cited passage from Gramophone Film Typewriter, I quote, all data flows had to be cut up, spaced, symbolized, in order to pass through the gate of the signifier, alphabet, grammatology, writing. As technological media, the gramophone and film store acoustical and optical data serially with superhuman precision. They launched a two-pronged attack on the monopoly that had not been granted to the book until the time of universal alphabetization, namely the monopoly on storage of serial data. The gramophone empties out worlds by bypassing their imaginary aspect, the signifieds, for their real aspects, the physiology. For the first time in human history, you see, come back for the first time in human history, I've heard this before, writing ceases to be synonymous with the serial storage of data. Evidently, Kittler, starting from other theoretical premises and aiming at establishing a different genealogy, is not particularly interested in the specificity of the cinema. His objective is the partial deconstruction of the primacy of writing, while avoiding the fallacy of assigning this role to either the voice or the image. Both are subsumed or sublated by the computer, because there, I quote, sound and image, voice and text are reduced to surface effects, known as to consumers as interfaces. Sense and the senses turn into eyewash. Their media-produced glamour will survive for an interim period as a byproduct of strategic programs. Inside the computers themselves, everything becomes numbers. Quantities without image, without sound or voice. With numbers, everything goes. Modulation, transformation, synchronization. Delay, storage, transposition. Scrambling, scanning, mapping. End of quote. The strategic programs set new parameters, and these bid farewell to both Derrida and Deleuze. An earlier Kittler had been in debt to Foucault when he argued that all the media are grounded in the body, not so much as extensions, prostheses, and compensations, as Marshall McLuhan had argued, but in a more disciplinary sense, in that gramophone, film, typewriter each have very specific relations to the somatics of the body and to the discourse networks in which they are imbricated. The technological media of sense, data, and perception are, in relation to the body, not an outside force, as Badiou complains of Derrida's transcendental immanence, but coded relays which reinscribe themselves into the body, where they shape the senses and their relation to the world in a constantly shifting assemblage of substitute formations, trading places between the three Lacanian registers of the imaginary, film, the symbolic, the typewriter, and the real gramophone. One may object to the determinism that posits these one-to-one correspondences, but the general thrust of Kittler's argument seems clear. The media technologies he is concerned with, which until the 20th century had as their material support either the human body, the sense organs of eye and ear, or speech, the psychophysics of media, have in the course of the 20th century emancipated themselves from these supports and are now materially dematerialized but immaterially present in electronic circuits. This would be Kittler's spiritual automaton, overcoming the opposition between mechanical and human by showing that we humans have always been at our most human and most spiritual when operating as network media technologies. Kittler's emphasis on the recording, the trace on storage, memory, and transmission access of sensory data privileges the phonograph and cinematograph over photography. For Kittler, in fact, photography belongs to the history of painting and sculpture, whereas the cinematograph was important not for its iconicity or its indexicality of place, site, and space, but rather because of its ability to index duration. Both gramophone and film were revolutionary precisely by their capacity of storing time. The crucial point, however, in our context, is that the storage of time as a direct, unimpeded, automated data flow is not only inimical to art, but also inimical to sense. The cinema is historically significant in that in its essence it is meaningless. Not nonsense, but what one might call N-sense, with N here standing perhaps for noise, for neural, or for the nth degree, the too much of sense. Mise-en-scène, montage, compositional aesthetics, etc. would then not be part of the cinema's inherent nature, or its countervailing force, but a secondary, hysterical, paranoid, or merely disciplinary response to automation, now understood as another name for the Lacanian real. Rather than extracting sense from sensory impressions, a film's narrative, genre, mise-en-scène would be ways of imposing sense on n-sense. But here we are close to Rancière, always ultimately failing to quite tame the kinetic presence of the technological real, or to altogether mute what Heidegger would call das Grundrauschen der Existenz, the all-encompassing white noise of sheer existence. I come to my conclusion. I can now return to my primitive philosophical question of why is there cinema, why does it exist, and speculate where these arguments have taken me. They suggest that the cinema is a powerful agent not for instantiating subjectivity or indeed artistic expressivity, but for getting rid of them, helping an ongoing and seemingly irreversible process of depersonalization and exteriorization. For Deleuze, as we saw, cinema is the name for a state where matter is movement and movement is matter. Nothing else needs to exist. Neither secured in a subject nor constrained by human scale, size, or proportion, the cinema's automatic and autonomous movement ideally requires an entirely different set of coordinates, one where our brains and bodies are integral parts of the world, freeing us of interiority, healing the many separations and self-divisions of the self by handing them over to the spiritual automaton. Cavell would seem to agree when in The World Viewed we read, I quote, "Insofar as photography satisfied a wish, it satisfied the human wish, intensifying since the Reformation, to escape subjectivity and to escape metaphysical isolation. Photography overcame subjectivity in a way undreamt of by painting, one which does not so much defeat the act of painting as escape it altogether, by automatism, by removing the human agent from the act of reproduction." End of quote. Read today, the word reproduction has a distinctly biogenetic ring to it, perhaps not intended by Cavell, but there for us nonetheless. Kittler, on the other hand, uses an anecdote of serendipitous contiguity from Daguerre's invention of photography and concludes from it, I quote, "Once they exist, artificial substances or machines are able to react to one another without human intervention, just as today's random processes between silicon and silicon dioxide, which computers ultimately consist of, relieve people of thinking." What Kittler asserts is that with the technical optical media, the role of coincidence has become structural. And actor network theories in a way formalize not only the extent to which the subject is a function of network effects or a matter of relationality, but may also explain how the cinema's automatism inscribes itself in the externalization of what used to be called intentionality or design, terms that may have to be coupled with assemblage, contingency, contiguity, or some such cognate notion in order to make sense. We might understand Deleuze's conjuncture of automatism and thought via Kittler's conviction that the automatic generation of sensory data, that is sonorous and optical data, puts all symbolic systems, including philosophy, into crisis. A crisis which for Deleuze is managed in the cinema through sensory motor coordination in the movement image and through deferral, repetition and delay in the time image. As a consequence, there is an automatism of thought that the cinemas help to new prestige and to new prominence. Free association and the talking cure, in other words, Freud's psychoanalysis, as well as automatic writing, Breton's Artaud and the Surrealists, would then be the mimetic responses, or indeed the rearguard actions, to the uncanny automatism of the cinematograph, an automatism of thought now better served by algorithms and electronic circuits. It would make the cinema, along with psychoanalysis, a transitional phenomenon at best, a valuable but finally expendable helpmaiden on the way to some other state of being. Such a conclusion, however, would be much too instrumental, much too technicist and teleological for a philosopher like Badiou, who in paraphrasing Deleuze is much more categorical. I quote, "For the automaton who has realized the giving up of all interiority, there is only the outside. But this outside cannot be confused with anything so commonplace as the external world. The automaton is a simulacrum that is without any relation to other simulacra. It is itself the pure assumption of the outside." As Deleuze notes concerning the canonical example of cinema, that's again a quote from Deleuze, "The automaton is cut off from the outside world, but there is a more profound outside which will animate it." End of quote from Deleuze. And I go on with Badiou. But what is the underlying principle of all animation? What populates the impersonal outside? What is it that composes forms therein? Let us call this element of the outside force. The name is appropriate, for inasmuch as it translates only by a constrained animation or by a setting into motion of the automaton thought, the outside only manifest as the imposition of a force. One of Deleuze's most constant themes, moreover, is that we only think when we are forced to think. Let this be a warning to all those who would see in Deleuze an apologist for spontaneity. Whatever is spontaneous is inferior to thought, which only begins when it is constrained to become animated by the forces of the outside. End of quote from Badiou. The cinema is thus the forces of the outside, to which no external world corresponds, but neither does a world of interiority and subjectivity. But how to imagine this force? Is it the untranscendable horizon of capitalism, of which the cinema is such an undeniable offspring? Or is it the empty place that confirms the groundless ground of our being? Is it the eyewash, die Augenwischerei, that distracts us from our failure to comprehend either abstract numbers or quantum physics, that is, the forces that do govern the universe, while nonetheless reminding us, and this would be the paradoxical sense in which the cinema restores belief in the world, reminding us that these forces do indeed exist. It is a proposition that makes the cinema both historical and contemporary. Historical, in that during the roughly 100 years of its existence, the cinema has done its job, namely curing us of subjectivity, interiority, individuality, and intentionality, at least as thoroughly as, for instance, the other narcissistic wounds inflicted by Freudian psychoanalysis and Marxism, both of which also attempted to wean us from believing we could ever be either fully present to ourselves or in charge of our own fate. Now, having accomplished this, the cinema could now become old and outdated with dignity and pride, ready to be celebrated and commemorated like any other human achievement that had done its cunning work of reason behind our backs, as Hegel or Marx would say. The cinema, on the other hand, would be contemporary in that its digital reincarnation continues to ask, what world is it to which its sounds and images can solicit us? A world we do not own or possess, a world that hosts us in all our sensory capacities and moral faculties, but also in its indifference to us. In which case, does the cinema exist and continue to do so, not in order to enjoy its own obsolescence, but rather to reconcile us humans to our own obsolescence? It's not a new thought, but one worth thinking, nonetheless, in and with the cinema, in and with philosophy. Thank you very much.